Welcome to Lectionary Call-In for Tuesday, July 21st of 2020, where two laypersons, a pastor and an academician, gather for about 55 minutes each week to discuss the Gospel Lectionary for the coming Sunday. And this Sunday is July 26th. Each Tuesday, we simply call in from wherever we may be at 6:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And for our friend Charles Willard in Minnesota, that's 5:30 a.m. Our little team is working to be faithful to Lectionary Year A. And if you're focusing on the Gospel Lectionary this week, we hope this will provide areas of focus and reflection. And here's our approach. We work independently in advance of the call-in with some preliminary information or questions on what the lead-off person on the call would like to discuss, and then we develop perspectives, share, encourage, and challenge each other. And here are the folks joining us in today's discussion.
Bill Hall.
Sarah Mickelson.
Charles Willard.
And I'm Don Upton, and our friend Bill Hull is the lead-off person this week, so it's all yours, my friend. Hope you're doing well.
I am. Good morning to Don, Charles, and Sarah, and depending on when others are listening, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We're glad to have you as a part of this conversation. A couple of brief comments, and then we will read the scripture. Today we finish a series of parables in the 13th chapter of Matthew. We've reviewed the story of the sower and the 4 different kinds of soil, the story of the wheat and weeds growing together with the instruction that we are not the ones to separate the wheat and weeds. And now today we come to a series of short parables involving 5 or 6, if like some, you consider verse 52 to be a short parable. And I have expanded the lectionary reading slightly, adding verses 34, 35, and 54, and I will comment on that later in our responses. I've asked my team members to help me read this together, and we will start with Sarah in a moment. Our scripture adjusted from the lectionary is Matthew 13, 31 to 35, 44 to 54, the first part of verse 54. Sarah, if you would start reading the word of the Lord for us.
He put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it is grown, it is the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened.
Jesus told the crowds all these things in parables. Without a parable, he told them nothing. This was to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet. I will open my mouth to speak in parables. I will proclaim what has been hidden from the foundation of the world.
The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which someone found and hid. And then in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. On finding one pearl of great value, he went and sold all that he had and bought it. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and caught fish of every kind. When it was full, they drew it ashore, sat down, and put the good into the baskets, but threw out the bad. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come out and separate the evil from the righteous and throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.
Have you understood all this? They answered, yes. And Jesus said to them, therefore, every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like the master of a household who brings out his treasure, what is new and what is old. When Jesus had finished these parables, he left that place. He came to his hometown and began to teach the people in their synagogues. The word of the Lord, thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God.
Charles, you want to?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Bill. I wanted to make just a couple of observations. One is that we need to think about how these parables and these narratives were constructed. And this is just a kind of a reminder that what we're getting is not a stenographic record of what Jesus said and when he said it and how he said it. This is a reconstruction by Matthew, and in this case, and by Mark, and by Luke, and by, in a very different way, John. It is a reconstruction of the life of Jesus, but it is not a reconstruction in the sense of a history, which is designed to provide information. This is designed to provide information, but it is designed to provide information with a purpose, a particular purpose. And although we assume, just because that's the picture that we bring with us when we read the text, we assume that each of these texts was written by a gospel writer who undertook to provide as best masculine, he could, they were men, the words and teachings of Jesus. But there's a catch. These were not designed to be histories. These were not designed to report history as it happened. These are designed to report the life and speaking and words of Jesus and actions of Jesus in service to a particular goal. And the goal was the conversion. These are texts that are put together not just to represent what happened, but to put together and represent what happened with the purpose of making sure people got it. And my little thought right now is that we need to think about the possibility that what Jesus actually said, if we can use that language, is what the parables themselves. The rest of it, the explanation of the parables, the description of the parables, are in fact constructs of the gospel writer to set the stage, to set the particular parable being quoted into words. And I'm not so sure that Jesus himself spent a whole lot of time in trying to explain the parables to his disciples. A parable is self-explanatory. Once you hear it, you get it or you don't, and an explanation is not. It's like explaining why a joke is funny. It's funny because it's funny, and an explanation is not going to make it funnier. My second comment is to commend to the listeners of this podcast or the experiencers of this presentation is that there's another one that actually precedes us, and appropriately, because what that one does, this is the one called Followers of the Way, Along the Way, and did I get that right? All right, so this one, it's where the four pastors in the church talk about the same thing we're talking about, the same collection of New Testament material, but they do it in a very different way. Their time is spent in constructing and in looking to find out what, in terms of another biblical scholar, Christopher Stendhal, described as what it meant. And what you're hearing in the conversation today is, for the most part, not so much about what it meant, but what it means. And I think those are two different things, but I think that they're both positive things. And I encourage people who listen to this one to make sure that they listen and watch the other one, and vice versa.
Good. Thank you, Charles. Somewhat building on that, believing that in fact Matthew wrote his gospel with particular purposes in mind, we're going to dive in here in a moment. I will note that, as Charles has indicated, there's the challenge every time we go over these passages to listen carefully to what it meant originally, and then to seek to understand how it informs our faith today. And there's also the risk of familiarity. We've been over these, And so I'm attempting to, at least for myself in my work on this, to look for, not for novelty, but for some freshness and understanding both what Matthew's purpose may have been. I think that's the best we can do, is what it may have been, and then how it will speak to us today in our very challenging times. Now, I think there's the value of drilling down on what it said then is valuable, but we can get so deep into that detail that we may miss the overall picture. And these parables today come pretty rapid fire, and I think there may be a purpose in that. Jesus says it's like this. Well, it's like that. Oh, and it's like it. The kingdom of heaven is like. The kingdom of heaven is like. And so for our first round of discussion, I suggest this that I've sent to my colleagues in advance. What specific messages do you hear, and what is the overall impression these stories make on you? And along with that, what might have been Matthew's purpose in placing the stories at this place in his narrative, especially his including the leaven, hidden treasure, pearl, and net stories, which are unique to Matthew. They're only reported in Matthew. So, what specific messages, overall impression, and some guesses about Matthew's purpose? And I didn't signal ahead of time, but Don, I'm going to go to you first, and then Sarah.
Thank you, and hello. So I've got specific messages, an overall impression, and then why is it positioned where it's positioned, right? Okay. So for folks listening in, maybe encountering these for the first time, preparing to teach a class, involved in a study on this, I'm going to go and answer specifically, but just a reminder, there's many other ways to look at this, I think. There's messages about the kingdom of heaven. How we listen and how we read, I think, is a part of this. I think there's also a section on how you use parables. I mean, it's actually a question, I think, that's raised in this. How do you use them? And I think there's also a piece in here about how we know what we know. How do we use the natural world to agree on things? So there's a little bit of epistemology in there, Charles. But I'm going to choose the first two, messages about the kingdom and how we listen and how we read. And so I'm going to choose, my takeaway is it's about contrast and it's about the passage of time. And the example I can give on contrast is I'm reading, for some reason, I started with commentary that said, if you've been thinking about growth and development, let's say mustard seed over time, and the nurturing and the maturing, knowing where it's going to go, how about try something new? How about just go for the contrast, because there's no middle. There's the seed, and then there's the tree. There's the seed and the things where birds nest. There's no middle at all. And so that was instructive for me, Bill. So the example I would give would be, and this would apply to several of them, where it does cut to the chase. Last week we dealt with the middle of the story, what happens in the middle. This does cut to the chase. It's just startling, right? You have the seed, and then you have the end. Contrast. So, Sarah, what I would use as an example is, in film, a jump cut in time. And I think this is, forgive me, Charles, biblical jump cutting. And in the age of film, which is almost gone, you literally would cut pieces out of the film, or as you're writing it, you would jump over time to make a point or to have someone think about potential and outcome, that there's a story behind it. A long story sometimes. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, a jump cut would be in something like A Wonderful Life. You jump cut from a boy, George Bailey, to a late teen, George Bailey. Well, what happened in the middle? In a film about kings and queens and royalty, you may see the child, and then you may see them as elders. If you see a version of Great Expectations, you'll see the boy Pip. Next thing you know, he's standing before Mrs. Habersham as a young man. Well, those are big choices to make. And I want to put out that this is a big jump cut to create contrast. It's the jump cut that leaps over generations. Think about films. What is the biggest jump cut you've ever seen in a film that goes from maybe a child to a generation beyond, or 2 generations beyond, where there's still context, but something else has happened. It's a kingdom. It's a large family. In the Bible, maybe one of the great jump cuts would be, there's a promise that your offspring will be like the sands, right? You can't number them. There's a jump cut in that as well. So the reason I'm raising that is maybe to help a class think creatively about taking that middle out, because in the case of some of these, it does. And it helps me to think about, well, we still have an understanding or a hope of what it could look like. And if it's forgotten, the reason, Bill, I think it's in the middle, why it's placed in Matthew at this point is things are going to happen. And it's carrying through for generations for, let's say, 1,900 years since Matthew was written. And we're still talking about that. And I could say, well, I've seen the mustard tree, and I know what a pearl is too, but jump cut to it allows me to think about the future. It allows me to think about fulfillment of the promise. It also allows me to look at, because I think it's multiple things. I think there are many pearls. I think there are many trees, and some are mature now, and some will be mature in the future. It's a way to think creatively, I think, of the kingdom and hope. And then the final note I'll say is on the pearl specifically, in a sense you could jump cut to that as well, that he found it, he found it, he got rid of everything, he puts it in his hand, and it's a way to say that this creative thinking about what's in the future, maybe beyond the arc of my life. In this case, the jump cut may leap beyond my life. It's not crazy. It's not madness. And I remember, Sarah, in Twelfth Night, Shakespeare, there's a point where the twin Sebastian is given a pearl by this wonderful person who's fallen in love with him that he's never seen before in his life. And he doesn't think it's real. He thinks he's crazy. She gives him a pearl, and he looks at the sky, and he says, that's the air, that's the glorious sun. This pearl, I feel it and see it, and note his wonder. It's not madness. It's real. I can touch it. So that's my starting point, Bill.
Thank you, Don. I appreciate. I didn't know. I understand the concept of jump cut. I'd never heard that phrase. I appreciate how you and Sarah enrich our discussion with your great knowledge of, and I'm being sincere, of literature and media. Thank you. Sarah, your thoughts on this?
So God's Word and the myriad of creation that springs forth from it have been sown in and before you. How God has planted or leavened or crafted a pearl or even treasure remains a mystery. So for you, Dawn, I like the jump cut thing that really resonated with me. But God, with intention, drops the seed. God, with intention, hides the yeast. God, with intention, places that irritant inside the oyster shell and starts the crafting of the pearl. God put the treasure in the ground. We are, and even the fish in the net, we are beneficiaries of a mystery that occurs between the actions of God and the bounty we receive directly from that hand. And I think these stories paint that mystery for us, that God with intention has seeded us. And we cannot, in all of our infinite wisdom and vanity and arrogance, look at anything around us and go, I see what stage of growth that's in. Because we don't know how to measure it. And we can resonate with it and go, oh, I agree with you, or I understand your point of view, or that really led me to a new understanding of something. But we can't really go on the spectrum of newly planted and mature enough to offer shade and shelter, or the pearl, knowing for sure when to open that oyster. We can't fathom the timing. And I think that goes back to the parable of the sower and the 4 types of soil, the seeds being thrown carelessly and gregariously everywhere. The parable of the wheat and the weeds. We are not the adjudicators of the maturity. We're not the adjudicators of anything other than I observed something marvelous, and it has become a treasure to me. So for these stories, I jump back to, this is all a description of the kingdom of heaven, in that God is at work. God is marvelously waiting for us to spring forth and shine our faces toward the sun. And I think that that's kind of what I see these particular passages and these parables all point to that. And that I think we can take great hope. I struggle, I guess like other seeds, to pop out of my exoskeleton and start to do things marvelously like grow. Either that or I'm stuck inside an oyster, I'm not sure which. And I think that that's what we're being given a glimpse into, is how God watches and waits for each of us.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Well said. I may be, well, first of all, it's obvious, and various commentaries point this out, that in this series of parables, and I think based on, because I went to work and got all the parables of the New Testament printed out, I think this is the one chapter in the Gospels that has this many parables in it. That I think is unique. And I've already noted that some of them are unique to Matthew. He uses examples of males and females from agriculture, fishing, places, and objects of value. I think that's part of it, as I've already said earlier. It's like this, it's also like that, and it's like one of the challenges we preachers have in illustrations is knowing our audience. What is going to communicate to somebody? And I think it would be true, if we could check this out, that any one illustration may connect with some listeners and others it makes no connection. That's just the nature of human communication. So for me, a part of Matthew's purpose is to again, back to scattering the seed, Sarah, as you said, it's like this, it's like that, it's like this. One of these examples, hopefully listeners you will connect with. Now, I may be making too much of something, but for the first time in reading this story, I caught something that may or may not be relevant. Verse 52. It says, Jesus says, therefore every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like the master of a household who brings out his treasure, what is new and what is old. That's one of the most cryptic parables I can imagine. And it says it's like a scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven. Now, it's possible that this is a fairly generic term, or it may be, as it is in other places in the gospel, a specific reference to an identified group of scholars. The Scribes and Pharisees were often the protagonists of Jesus. They are the ones who are resisting his message. Jesus here uses a term, it seems to me, in at least a neutral, if not a positive way. The scribe is like someone who runs a household, who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old. Now, the impression that makes on me is if I do that, my wife and I are still working through family memorabilia, even 6 years after we moved here. And what goes on when you're going through memorabilia? What do we keep? What do we discard? and the trips down memory lane. So to me, it's a picture of an openness of possibilities. It's before me, and he just says that. He doesn't say what the owner of the house does with these things. He just says these are treasures, new and old. Now, again, I may be reading into it more than was intended by Matthew, but for me, it's again about a choice. I have a choice to look at, for example, what of my heritage do I want to continue, and what do I want to choose to change? The parables do that for me. It's, here's a choice. Where do you go from here? Again, I'm not sure about that. So to me, the overall impression is the kingdom is described in many, many ways. According to my count, and I could be wrong, there are 22 parables in Matthew, 7 in Mark, and 27 in Luke, 19 of which are only in Luke. That, to me, illustrates that each of the gospel writers, that some of the ones they all told, but each said, oh, by the way, it's like this. You know, Luke has, in chapter 15, the ones about being lost that we treasure. I kind of feel like I'm rambling, but I think that's part of the purpose of the parables, to keep wandering and wondering, what is the kingdom of heaven really like? Charles, you want to add anything before we go to the next question?
Well, yes, two things. One is that I think somewhere along the way here, it tells us that Jesus told them these parables, but he didn't say any more. I mean, a parable stands for itself, and the explanation is the add-on of the hearer, how the hearer hears that particular parable. And I think one of the problems we have is considering the possibility that what Jesus actually said was closer to the parable itself, period. And he left it just like that, but because a parable is supposed to have that character. The parable shouldn't need to be explained. A parable is self-explanatory. That's comment number one. Comment number two is that, just a sidebar, the phrase, it's like the master of the household who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old. The phrasing of that verb, bringing out, is probably not the best translation of the Greek. It's the Greek. The translation has it, imagine, like he brings these treasures out and sets them out for view or review or whatever. But the actual translation of the Greek term that is underlies that wording is not bring out, but it is throw out, discard. And it's the translators of the King James Version which brought in and interpreted that verb in a way that seemed better to them, but those are the translators. That's not the verb itself. The verb itself is more often characterized as it would be translated, he threw out. So he took them both out and set them aside. I'm going to stop there.
Okay, thank you. Second one, and Don, let's see, Sarah, I will start with you here in a moment. Now, here again, I may be reaching, but quick background to the question I want to pose for us next. Recently, I was introduced to a scholar I had not heard of before, William Herzog. I don't have in front of me his bio, but he was quite a scholar and is now deceased. And I came across portions of his book entitled Parables as Subversive Speech, Jesus as Pedagogue of the Oppressed, in which he asserts that, quote, the focus of the parables was not on the vision of the glory of the reign of God, but on the gory details of the way oppression served the interests of the ruling class, end quote. According to Dr. Herzog, in the time and culture of Christ, the top 2% of the population controlled nearly 70% of the annual wealth of the societies, and the vast majority of the population, about 70%, were peasants who worked the land and lived in the towns and villages that dotted the countryside. Interesting percentages here. 2% controlled 70% of the wealth, and 70% of the people were peasants. Now, my question is there any validity to Dr. Herzog's analysis? And if so, how might the parables of Jesus address our current concern about income inequality and racial justice? And Don, Sarah, before I go to you, a comment that, again, this may be a reach, and there are other parables, it seems to me, that are clearly addressing income inequality, but in my mind, these offer some thoughts, some challenges in those areas. So, Sarah, what did this stir in you?
Well, confusion first. Because this is a path of, or a lens I hadn't imagined on these particular parables, I see the leaven, and I see the conversations about mustard seeds as being much more within the reach of people who are economically disadvantaged. The treasure and the pearl, I hesitate on those because I think that those are analogies that people who understand wealth, who have seen wealth, would know. So I don't know that my first entree into these things is looking for how these represent income inequality and racial injustice or racial justice, in that Jesus doesn't seem to use those as filters for who he speaks to. And if I had to guess, I would imagine the people that followed him had some wealth or some didn't. And that would probably help explain the feeding of the 5,000.
Okay.
That's my first blush.
Okay. Thank you. Don?
Thank you. I appreciate your question because it was a struggle, and maybe Sarah and I were starting in the same place, but I learned to like it. But I have to say, I didn't read the text from which you drew the question. So I'm kind of on my own, out on a limb. So here's my best shot. It seems to me that justice and access make the world look different. And since these parables are about using the natural world, our imagination on things that we actually know and see and touch, that this is about justice is sometimes over the mountain, but we need a vision. A lot of conversation about that today, about, we haven't arrived. Do we all share the same mission? Do we know what access and justice actually looks like? And so I think there's a mustard seed in there. I think there's pearl in there. I think there's even a way to think about the implicit biases that every human being carries with them, because we inherit an idea and then it gets overturned. So subversive for me is like it's completely flipped over or exploded, or it's tossed up in the air. It's really different when it lands back. Do you know what it looks like when it lands? Do you know that that's a mustard tree? Do you know that's a pearl? Do you know it's beautiful? So I think everybody grows up in a culture, and we inherit an expectation on how the world looks. When you walk down the street, who do you see? You go to shop. Who is there? What does the world look like? What is the economic structure? You take it for granted. I would, How do you measure success? What is relevant to you? What do you identify as the system where you feel comfortable, where you belong? It seems natural, doesn't it? What does beauty look like? I think beauty's in here, the pearl. It's not just value. It's a promise, and Jesus gives something that's beautiful. What does it look like? So I think justice doesn't look like the world we live in. There's a lot of gospel in that, and I think there's a lot of truth today. There's a great jump cut you could make. John Lewis as a young teen preaching in Birmingham. For those listening in the future, Congressman Lewis just passed away, and you want to do the jump cut in the film, have him his last speech before Congress, and you go, well, that doesn't, right? But that's the mustard tree, right? How's that? That's an interesting jump cut. That's got a contrast to it. He's elected to Congress, one of the largest, most dynamic cities in the world. What is that? So I think justice doesn't look the same. And you said subversion or subversive, very close to conversion or turning around. In this case, I think it's a turning over. It's like a whole fruit basket turnover. And then what does it look like? And I think for things like the field and the pearl, there's another conversion can make it really work for me. Is if he's selling everything he has to have the pearl, which is identified in his mind as beautiful, there's a conversion there, an economic conversion, that you put the pile of everything that he has and the system in which he manages it, whatever all that wealth is that he has, and it's gone, but it's represented in the pearl. That's a funny jump cut. It's like, here's my stuff, and it has value, and now I have greater value because I understand the identity of the pearl. There's a conversion going on. It's like, how do you use your resources differently? And what comes out of it is kind of an astonishing world, and it requires a promise because a lot of folks have a tough time stepping over that. Culture is tough. Culture feels like religion and vice versa. So I that's where I went with this, and I'm even thinking about, economic examples where if the world were flipped over and you lived differently, we all lived differently, and we participated economically in different ways, it's not that that's just a great idea, but, some of us have to get over ourselves because that doesn't look like the world that I know today at all. So imagine that. I'm thinking about Voltaire when he was in exile in London, and this is a nasty paraphrase, 21st century. But he's walking around the docks. He can't get away from the docks in London. He's like, I'm really rough paraphrase, but he's going, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. There's a whole different economic system here. There are people from all over the world. I can't even keep up with the languages that are being spoken here. I couldn't imagine this. I don't want to leave. This is the world I want to live in. It's like nothing. And it's a commerce of ideas and a different kind of commerce, and everyone's welcome, and they're bringing in things. They're from all over the world. So I think, for me, justice just looks different, and I think that's in the parables, Bill. That's the best thing I could come up with.
Thank you. Appreciate those examples. I will acknowledge that given the times we're in, this lens of economic justice and racial equality is very much in the forefront. And I'll acknowledge that I come to almost anything with that concern lingering there. And I'm grateful for what Palmacia Presbyterian Church is seeking to do at this time with the book study on the cross and the lynching tree and some other I don't know if any of you got the email about some possibilities with our African-American friends. I forget the name of the church, but you know what I'm talking about. And by the way, I commend Followers of the Way because they do a good job of going into the details about these parables. For example, reminding us that mustard seed was not a popular crop. It was not necessarily a good thing. I do remember as a child being told the definition of a weed is a plant out of place. So John, in his short sermon last Sunday, did a good job of that. I hope you saw that what is considered a weed by one person is a plant by another. Now, what stirred in me was that how often Jesus comes down on the side of the least of these. One of the most powerful passages in Scripture for many of us. The punchline, if I can use that, that's probably not the best term. The The kicker is when you did it or did not do it to the least of these, you did or did not serve me, Jesus Christ. That is a haunting message. How might we miss? It's one thing to think about being altruistic and helping other people. But as I heard George Buttrick say in a sermon on that passage, the gospel, we think the gospel is looking at somebody in need there, but by the grace of God go I. Buttrick said that's not the gospel. The gospel is there goes Jesus Christ. Powerful. So Jesus often came down on the side of the least of these. He referred, you need to be like a child. He referred to them as little ones. The workers in the vineyard, where everybody got paid the same. The wedding feast where, well, if the wealthy won't come, invite the poor and the lame. And rich man and Lazarus and the persistent widow. It's clear that Jesus came down on the side of those who were considered least. Recently, I heard David Brooks' sermon. It's on YouTube. I commend it to you, at the National Cathedral. Now, here is a commentator from the New York Times who identifies as Jewish. If you listen to that sermon, I think you will hear a powerful awareness and understanding and appreciation for the person and ministry of Jesus Christ. And Brooks, I didn't write it down, but he quotes a number of statistics of how many, not revolutions, but revolutionary actions took place during the time of Christ. He focuses on how much unrest there was, and in effect, dealing around in part what we now call economic inequality. He's of course a tremendously intelligent and eloquent person. I commend it to you. And the mustard seed and yeast are small. They work silently yet powerfully. It takes time. And Don, I had already written this down about John Lewis. You think about it. Here is, if I may risk an analogy, who discovered a treasure and almost gave his life for it. One of the documentaries I watched says that he almost died from one of the attacks. We've seen the pictures of the unbelievable brutality at the George Pettus Bridge with the assault by the police officers. Here, John Lewis was a man who discovered a treasure and was willing, if necessary, to sell his whole life for that, and persisted in his quest for justice. And I included verses 34 and 35 to highlight how Jesus acknowledges that what he's teaching seems to be hidden. I think a part of the hiddenness is it doesn't make sense. It is subversive. It does turn things around. There's a reversal. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. And I understand your emphasis, Charles, that Jesus didn't explain the parables. That may be true, and the parables do need to stand on their own. But at least Jesus acknowledges it's. I also included verses 53 and 54 to remind us that each time Jesus talked, he moved on. I think there's a gospel in that. He did not stay in one place. He taught and he moved on. In this case, he goes to his hometown of Nazareth, where he is rejected. Here is Jesus offering these great lessons and seeking to have people understand, and his own hometown rejected him. We know, I think it's in Luke, it adds they tried to kill him. Matthew just says that Jesus he did not do many deeds of power there because of their unbelief. And then the next thing is the gospel reports the death of John, and then Jesus feeds the 5,000. He goes on doing what the parables advocate, it seems to me, paying attention to the least of these. In this case, several thousand people who didn't have the food that they needed. And I think that the gospel is much, and Jesus Christ, I think we have so domesticated Jesus that we lose, and I include myself in this, how radical Jesus was. That's why, I think Herzog's thesis is that Jesus was killed because of his challenge to the economic structure. Okay, I will stop with that. Charles, you want to speak to this question or offer any summary or other observations?
Just a couple of comments. One is that I think that Herzog is a good example of, in my own take, the difference between what it meant and what it means. And I think in this instance, the gospel can very well be understood and applied as subversive in terms of the way it works out in contemporary society. I'm not so sure that it was a subversive message at that time. I mean, not at least in the way that we think of subversion. I don't think Jesus was planning an overthrow of the government. I think he was simply declaring the gospel as he understood it and represented it, and that's what it was at that time. For us, it can mean something quite different, and we don't have to be worried about the fact that it is not what Jesus. Well, and back up one step further, we can't know what Jesus meant. We can't know what Jesus was thinking. We can't even know what Matthew, in his writing and interpretation of these parables, what he was thinking. All we can know, the closest we can get, is how it would have been understood in that time. That's the closest we can get, and to go further than that is just not possible. We can't go back and get into the mind of Jesus or into the mind of Matthew. We get in, we can approach, but we can't get there. The other comment, just sort of a side comment I wanted to make, is that the parable of the mustard seed is not that it was good for nourishment. The parable of the mustard seed is that this tiny thing became good for what? Well, good for providing places for birds to make their nests. That's what its job was. And so to say, well, people didn't like the mustard seed because they didn't want to plant it. They thought about where birds can be, that would be something else. And that's what the parable was about. The difference between this tiny thing and this great tree that it became, not that it was good to eat, but that it was good for a quite different purpose.
Good. Don, let me add something, and I know you're going to go around. Charles, you sparked in me something. I've got a quote here from Frederick Buechner that I think is worth the minute or two it'll take me to read it, and it speaks to what you were saying about how we understand subversion, which I agree with you. Buechner says, "What is the kingdom of God? Jesus does not speak of a reorganization of society as a political possibility or the doctrine of salvation as a doctrine. Jesus speaks of what it is like to find a diamond ring that you thought you'd lost forever. Speaks of what it is like to win the Irish sweepstakes. He suggests rather than spells out. He evokes rather than explains. He catches by surprise. He is sometimes cryptic, sometimes obscure, sometimes irreverent, always provocative. He tells stories, speaks in parables. And though we have approached these parables reverentially all these many years and have heard them expounded as grave and reverent vehicles of holy truth, I suspect that many, if not all of them, were originally not grave at all, but were antic, comic, often more than just a little shocking. I suspect that Jesus spoke many of his parables as a kind of sad and holy joke, and that they may be part of why he seemed reluctant to explain them, because if you have to explain the joke, you might as well save your breath. For God, all things are possible because God is the master of the impossible, and God is a master of the impossible because in terms of what humans think possible, God is in the end a wild and impossible God. Again, the power of the gospel, I think, is far more than we have yet understood or embraced. Don?
Thanks. Yeah, it's impossible, but what I'm pulling out of these is that there is a tangible thing that we're being handed. We can agree on the ecosystem that Charles is talking about that resides in the mustard tree. We can agree upon that a pearl is at a point of being in its fullness. The bread is baked. There is a fullness about this. There is a perfection. There is an end. There's a recognizable value in this upon which I think we can agree. And that we jump cut to it isn't meant to skip over everything. It's meant to say, that's real. That end, that fullness of time is real. And I'm wondering if there is maybe an expectation here, since I think it's not a mustard tree. There are many mustard trees in their fullness that have matured and passed and matured in ecosystems, that I think there's a message that we all get a glimpse of what the fullness is. If Christ goes, you know a pearl, you know a perfect, beautiful pearl, don't you? Yes, I do. I have a sense of what that is. Like Shakespeare says, I can touch it. I can feel it. It's not madness. It's real. The full-blown ecosystem of the tree, the bread, I can smell it. I can touch it. I can feel it. And I'm wondering if at times through our lives, if I've glimpsed a full tree, that I would meditate upon where it came from. Like if you said John Lewis, you saw him speaking in Congress, you jump cut to it. I had to meditate on it. And I think maybe I'm thinking what I'm called to do with this is when I've glimpsed those things in their fullness, and someone's opened the door to me, or I've seen justice, which recreates the whole world. I've seen it. I think I'm supposed to talk about it. You know, I've been there. Do not be afraid. I've been there. And I'm not saying because I know, because I have to be led. I need my friends. I need people around me to go, do not be afraid. I have a sense of what the fullness looks like. Look at this life. Look at this community. Look at this economy. Look at this healthcare system. Look, I've seen it. You can touch it. And maybe there's behind this a call to say it. I don't know. I've heard another story that's completely different, and it's wonderful. We've got about 2 minutes left here. Sarah, let me just go around and see if there's any follow-up from you.
Yeah, I'm taking to heart verse 52. Maybe you were like me, and at one point in time you had something like a shoebox into which you would put things that you found particularly treasure-worthy. Might be, for me, it was things like a bird's feather, a four-leaf clover, a particularly interesting seashell, a particularly interesting rock, something that I picked up at a particularly important point in my life. All of those go into my treasure box. And I'm in my mind's eye, I see this person who I am going to become holding that box and opening it up and being able to explain to the person I'm talking to. It may be my children. It might be my friend. It could be somebody I haven't even met yet. And go, this is why this is particularly valuable to me. And be able to go and look, here's a clipping from yesterday. Or here's a rock I found yesterday. Each of these things become a passage or a talisman through which I can explain the value of things that I have to someone else. And so maybe this is, in the sower who sowed on four soils, an example of what happens to seeds that have taken root and start to produce fruit and are, in Charles's language, put in a position of casting seed again. So if we have fulfilled our purpose and we have interpreted the scriptures and grown and enriched ourselves on the fullness of God, that in time we'll be casting out all those things that are valuable to us and sharing with other people.
Thank you. Bill Hull, anything to close?
I'm good, thank you.
Charles Willard?
Yes, I want to share something that was in the long article that I sent you last week or so by Barbara Brown Taylor. I read it again last night, and it struck me that it's appropriate now. Here, she's quoting Fred Craddock, another master preacher, and Fred Craddock was talking to her about sermons and their function, and he said, "People don't want you to tell them what they need to know." I'll repeat that. People don't want you to tell them what they need to know. They want you to say what they want to say but don't know how.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you. That's a great way to wrap up. And for folks listening in, Palmacia Presbyterian Church is at 3501 West San Jose Street. That's in Tampa, Florida. And for more information, you can go to palmacia.org. That's PALMACEIA.org. And if you're listening during the time of pandemic, lots of other resources at that site. Sermons, discussions of the same passages, alternative views, prayers, meditation. So we commend that to you during this time of quarantine. And you're always welcome. And we'll see you next time.